environmental act. Hello, and welcome to Adsum, a weekly recap of the biggest political and environmental news from the last week. We're your co-hosts, Aaron Danowski.
And I'm Jon Snow.
This week, we're going to be discussing free trade and globalization, which have become quickly considered the top economic orthodoxies of the past 20 to 30 years, but which now face stiff opposition from environmental activists, labor organizations, and even disparate political candidates on opposite sides of the spectrum, like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. But first, John and I will go through a quick recap of the week's biggest news. Our first story is analyzing the Iraqi army's offensive to retake Mosul from ISIS. This past Monday, Iraqi and Kurdish forces backed by the US-led air coalition began their military offensive to retake the ISIS-controlled city of Mosul in the northwest region of the country. Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi announced the opening of the campaign after months of preparation and planning, but many observers expect the operation could extend for weeks or even months. The U.S. military estimates approximately 3,000 to 4,500 ISIS fighters control the city and have resorted to increasingly brutal tactics to quash dissent among the city's 1 million plus residents. According to interviews with people who've escaped from Mosul in recent weeks and residents with contraband cell phones within the city, anyone caught trying to escape faces a $1 million dinar fine, approximately $825. And if the potential escapees are former members of the Iraqi army or police, they're subsequently beheaded. Resistance groups have formed within the city in response to harsh ISIS social codes, including the banning of smoking and whipping people who miss prayer or trim their beards, as well as a deepening economic crisis that has resulted in school closures, lack of electricity, and running water. According to UN human rights officials, ISIS militants have also recently taken 550 families from villages around Mosul to use as human shields in an effort to slow the progress of Iraqi and Kurdish forces. The UN expects hundreds of thousands of refugees to leave Mosul as the operation gains ground over the next several months. Our next story involves the President of the Philippines and his comments on the Filipino-American relations in China this past week. This past Thursday, during a visit to China, President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines announced a quote-unquote separation with the United States and a realignment with China, shaking up the balance of power in the South China Sea. At a meeting with several hundred Chinese business leaders, Duterte announced, quote, "I've realigned myself with your ideological flow, and maybe I will also go to Russia to talk to President Vladimir Putin and tell him that there are three of us against the world: China, Philippines, and Russia," end quote. This represents a major shift in Filipino-US relations. The two countries have had an alliance that has included strong military and economic cooperation for over the past 70 years. The vast majority of Filipinos hold positive views of the United States, and with China claiming control over the South China Sea and Filipino-claimed waters in recent years, the U.S. has sought to assert its own influence in the region using Filipino military bases as its place of operation. With souring diplomatic relations between the two countries, the U.S.'s influence in the region may be severely diminished. Duterte, who's known for his ad hoc speaking style and bombastic rhetoric, has made no secret of his disdain for the United States over the past several months. He's previously called President Obama a son of a bitch and told him to go to hell. Part of this animosity can be traced back to the U.S.'s disapproval of Duterte's policy of extrajudicial killings of criminals. Duterte has come under international scrutiny for allowing police and vigilantes to kill thousands of suspected drug dealers and users without a fair trial, and the U.S.'s views have led Duterte to say that he will not visit America due to concerns that he and his country will be insulted. Our next story involves a state of emergency that's been declared in the African country of Ethiopia. This past week, over 1,600 people were arrested by government forces for being affiliated with violent anti-government protests that have been occurring in Ethiopia over the past 11 months. Human rights groups say that at least 500 people in the Oromia region surrounding the capital of Addis Ababa have died during anti-government protests as a result of clashes with security forces. Protesters are angry at the disproportionate control the Tigray minority have over the Ethiopian government, a situation that stems from the Tigray's leadership in the 1991 guerrilla war that overthrew the communist military regime of Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. Ethiopia's prime minister announced a 6-month state of emergency in early October, curbing the rights to assemble, the right to protest, and establishing a 6 p.m. curfew. He also included the restriction of the use of social media, mobile devices, and the sending of messages that the government considers will, quote, create chaos, suspicion, or discord among people, end quote. Security forces have been granted the power to stop and search suspects and to investigate homes without court authorization. Human rights group Amnesty International has criticized these measures, saying that they are, quote, so broad they threaten basic human rights that must not be curtailed.
Our next story is a continuation of something that we talked about last week, which was Amy Goodman being charged with riot charges by North Dakota. And as of last week, on this past Monday, the 17th, Amy Goodman, the charges against her were dropped by the North Dakota district judge, which is a very important development because it is a victory for free speech and freedom of the press. You know, she did a wonderful job of covering what was going on at the North Dakota pipeline protests. And the fact that she was even charged with a crime, they tried to charge her with a crime, was worrying because it seemed like it was the beginning of a slippery slope to oppressing the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so this is a very important victory, in my opinion. And the next story that I'm sure everyone has heard about is the debate this past Wednesday between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And despite, with all the insults and all the interruptions, and the biggest thing that stood out to me was the fact that still this third debate, they still didn't even touch on climate change and environmental policy, and that is a big problem because it is such a widespread and important issue that we're facing today. And the fact that in 3 debates in this presidential cycle, in this election cycle, we have not covered environmental policy one bit. And that is very worrying because it is such a profound issue that we're facing today. So I wanted to get Aaron's opinion on this and ask him about it, and if you want to say a few words.
Yeah. I've seen reports, journalists coming out and attacking the moderators and saying this is a crime of negligence for not pressuring the candidates to discuss the issues of environment and environmental policy. 4.5 hours of debate, and not once did the significantly different perspectives that the candidates have on climate change come up. Donald Trump doesn't believe that climate change exists. It's a hoax created by the Chinese government to beat us on trade or something like that. And while Hillary Clinton has a strong policy in terms of trying to increase the amount of renewable energy that the United States uses, she's been accused in the past of peddling fracking and the fracking industry around the world during her time as Secretary of State, and has also refused to come out yet with an official position on the ongoing protests occurring at the Sacred Stone camp in North Dakota. So I think that this is a really interesting issue that, whatever the results of the election are in a couple weeks, the environmental activists and the people out here who really care about the climate are really going to have to pressure the candidates to act and to make it a part of their essential platform.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that this is an issue that affects every one of us, and it's just so shocking to me that it never came up in these debates, and it doesn't seem to be much of an issue that voters are focusing on, and I think that is a shame, and it's very important that we continue to talk about it in any way we can, and expand our discussion of this in order to increase awareness, because if it's not going to take place on the debate stage, it's going to need to take place elsewhere. Our next story is actually just developing as of earlier this evening, so we don't have a whole lot of information about it, but I thought that we would mention it. AT&T announced a merger with Time Warner for worth $85 billion, and this is an important story not only for consumers but also for antitrust and monopoly regulation, to looking forward to seeing what is going to happen with this merger. And experts are saying it's going to take maybe even a year to sort this all out and for the government to either approve or condemn this merger. But in the meantime, I think it's worth reflecting on the effects of what this is going to have on the average consumer and the environment of big business in general. That if this is successful and goes through, it's just going to continue to create an environment where corporations are able to get what they want and to exploit the system in a way for the sake of profit.
Mm-hmm. I was reading earlier, John, that this is something I didn't realize. AT&T has more customers than Comcast, and so by this merger going through, you would be coupling the number of users that AT&T already has for its telecommunication services with Time Warner subsidiary companies and media sources like HBO, CNN, and even Warner Brothers, to create kind of this behemoth in the media sphere. Honestly, I have a hard time believing that even the companies themselves believe that this will get past regulators. But hey, give them an A for effort, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just when I think about this, especially because they're media companies, it can be kind of worrying that these companies are merging and they will have such a enormous audience under their they'll have an enormous resource of media under their control, and they'll be able to control it in the way that they want. And that can be worrying, especially if you're talking about like police states and sort of dystopian futures, which, with Donald Trump, just it may seem likely. But it's like when I think of what this could do, I think of 1984. They get total control over the media, and this is not that extreme by any means. But it's a start, and it just seems like it could snowball from there.
The other thing to consider too with this, before we get to our main story in a second, is that by bringing together these two multi-billion-dollar companies, you're also not just kind of consolidating profit making, but you're also consolidating political influence. So you're gathering corporate interests underneath the same umbrella that can be used in a post Citizens United kind of era to influence public policy in favor of these companies even further. I think that that's really one of the things that it strikes me. And I saw a post about this earlier by Robert Reich, former labor secretary, who is a strong Bernie supporter, and is also very, very concerned about the influence of corporations in government. So something to keep an eye on in the next couple weeks. Now we turn to the central question that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this podcast. The collapse of the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement and its implications for free trade, globalization, and the environmental movement moving forward. After 7 years of negotiations, Friday marked a heartbreaking conclusion to Canadian Trade Minister Chrystia Freeland's hopes for brokering a free trade agreement between Canada and the EU. Despite the support of all 28 EU national governments in favor of this deal, the regional parliament of Wallonia in Belgium, with a population of only 3.5 million, has rejected the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, called CETA for short, which is now forcing the Belgian government to withhold its assent. Since all the countries in the EU must agree unanimously on trade agreements, belonging as they do to a common market, Belgium's inability to provide its assent means that this deal is, in essence, dead. The Wallon government's opposition comes from concerns that pork, beef, and dairy imports from Canada would threaten local industries, and that the agreement's clause, calling for the creation of an independent court system to settle disputes between states and foreign investors, would be used by multinationals to dictate domestic public policy. Although these concerns are coming from a relatively small region in Belgium, they are the same concerns that are expressed time and time again by environmental, labor, and anti-globalization activists and organizations around the world. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement aimed to eliminate tariffs on most of the goods traded between Canada and EU markets, and some estimates suggest that if it were passed, trade volume between these two markets would increase by more than 20%, leading to economic growth and cheaper consumer goods. Critics, meanwhile, say that an increase in trade would reduce local employment in industries in specific countries and transfer power from national governments to multinational corporations. Martin Schulz, the head of the European Parliament, has said that he will hold emergency talks with the Walloon government in an effort to try and salvage the deal. But the Canadian Trade Minister, Chrystia Freeland, did not express optimism about the chances of success. Upon leaving her meeting with the Walloon government, she was quoted as saying, "It seems obvious that the EU is now not capable of having an international agreement, even with a country that shares European values such as Canada." Donald Tusk, president of the European Council, told reporters that unless people were convinced trade agreements were in their interest, quote, "I am afraid that CETA could be our last free trade agreement," end quote. In light of the breakdown of talks over CETA, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into questions about free trade, because it's a topic that has come up several times in the political, election cycle that we have here in the United States, and that not many people understand. It doesn't come intuitively to many people. So to start our dialogue, John, I wanted to start by asking you, how much do you know about free trade, and what questions might you have that can kind of get us started?
Well, the answer to your question is not much. Mostly what I know about these kinds of trade agreements are from passing conversation or mention in the media, or even in this election cycle with Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump opposing such trade agreements as NAFTA or TPP or TTIP. And so, one question I have for you are, what exactly are these trade agreements, and what do they do, or what are they trying to accomplish for the different countries that are involved? And then why would someone oppose these types of agreements?
Mm-hmm. So, in essence, the idea behind a free trade agreement is that several nations will come together around the negotiating table and agree to eliminate tariffs on goods that are exchanged over borders. Now, by tariff, I mean taxes that are imposed on foreign made goods. So, for example, if John, you wanted to buy a beautiful painting or something that was made here in the United States. If the United States did not have a free trade agreement with a place like the EU or Mexico or Canada or wherever, chances are that in order to protect the industry in the United States, whenever a painting or whatever the good may be that is imported, whenever that good is imported, a tax is imposed on it to increase its price. That way, it gives customers an incentive to buy products that are made within the country because it's cheaper. Now, by eliminating tariffs and these taxes on goods that are produced abroad, economists and trade experts say that this benefits the consumer in addition to all countries involved. A, because it increases the amount of trade that occurs between different nations. B, because at the end of the day, if something can be made much more cheaply in a place like China or wherever than it can in the US, customers who are trying to buy things in the United States can buy things for much cheaper. So that's the basic idea behind free trade. It's the idea that by reducing restrictions and by basically integrating into a global market, customers benefit, the economy overall benefits, and everybody's better off. Now, the flip side, and the reason why many people would say that they oppose free trade agreements like Bernie Sanders, is because oftentimes when trade increases, that means that local industries are decimated. For example, when Bernie Sanders or even Donald Trump talks about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed in the late 90s, I think it actually something around 1994. When they talk about that, they talk about the loss of jobs that created, especially in places like the automotive industry. And that's because they say that manufacturing jobs leave the country. They go to places like Mexico because labor is less expensive there. And so people in Michigan will lose their jobs. People don't like that. So even though they may, cars might be less expensive, less people have jobs. So that's a big concern. Also, the benefits that accrue for being able to produce things more cheaply generally only result in increased profits for companies. The benefits aren't passed on to customers. And so instead of free trade helping everyone, a lot of people see free trade as helping corporations.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and that clears a lot of things up. Why people like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders would not support these types of trade agreements, especially the fact that they inadvertently help corporations only and not the consumer. Because originally, the intention that it seems to have is balancing, the desires and wants of a consumer and corporations themselves. But it seems like the corporations outweigh the wants and needs of the consumer.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, there's kind of a spectrum on which people will fall when it comes to free trade. Some people say we shouldn't have it at all. Some people say we should, do it with no restrictions. And then there's a middle ground where people say, well, free trade can be good, but it can be used for the benefit of corporations rather than people. And so they claim that there needs to be almost like a redistribution of the benefits from free trade so that everybody wins. For example, that might take the form of using the increase in tax revenue from the companies that get more business to fund job training programs for people whose jobs are lost because of outsourcing or offshoring, things like that. And also, since a lot of the benefit of free trade results in increased business profits, which is reflected by business stocks, the people who own the stocks are generally the ones that benefit the most financially from free trade agreements. So there's a group of people who say that that's the best way to go. Now, there are also people who say that this is the best way for developing countries to grow their economies, is to join this kind of global community and trade what they have.
And sort of piggybacking off the success of other companies or other countries in a way.
Exactly. Inviting companies to invest in where they are and bring jobs with them. But the problem with that is that oftentimes it results in what's called a race to the bottom. Have you heard that term before? Race to the bottom? It basically means that when jobs are shipped elsewhere, when companies are given the ability to choose where they make their goods, they will go to the places where it costs the least. So if it costs $2 an hour to manufacture clothes in Vietnam versus $10, $15 an hour to manufacture them in the US, many companies will say, well, it's worth going to Vietnam because we will make more money in the long run. Even that, if that involves, that we have to make more things there, build buildings or things. The problem is that only works for certain countries. So the countries that are best positioned to try and attract these businesses are the ones that have decent infrastructure. They have raw materials. They have a large labor force. That's part of the reason why China has been so effective at becoming the manufacturing hub of the world, is because they have a lot of people who are willing to work for very little, and the government doesn't impose strong environmental regulations on the production. So the decreased cost of production never actually filters down to the consumer, because it's just, they would price the clothing around the same as they would if they were making it in America, but they're just retaining all the profits in the corporation themselves. More or less. They might drop the price a little bit, but not nearly at the same level as they should. I would say should. Because if they're competing with people who make their clothes locally, they can afford to mark their costs a little bit lower and still have that advantage. So opening it up, and if one country does it, or if one company does it, that can lead a bunch of other companies to go and do it too, to try and remain competitive and to stay in business.
So a lot of the opposition to these trade agreements are coming from people who have lost their jobs in America or in other countries that are involved in these agreements. Is that what I understand?
That's one area of kind of detractors. Lower income, kind of blue collar workers who feel like America has lost a lot of jobs in that industry that can afford to feed a family, and now they have to work multiple jobs or work at a fast food chain where they don't get paid as well. Other groups who oppose these measures include environmentalists and labor unions and organizations. Environmentalists say that by creating a race to the bottom, you're creating an incentive for countries not to take environmental degradation seriously. prioritizing basically economic growth and companies coming and investing over protecting the environment and protecting, reducing carbon emissions.
It seems strange to me that American companies who choose to go and base their operations in other countries where the environmental limitations are less, the environmental policies are less strict, still aren't subject to American environmental policies. It's like they're still companies, American companies. They just produce their products in other countries.
And oftentimes it's even worse than that. Not only are they not subject to American laws, but many times free trade agreements will set their own laws separate from the laws of either of the countries that are engaged in it. So if, for example, I mentioned in the CETA example, this area in Belgium is concerned because the agreement calls for the creation of an independent court system, a system that isn't based on Belgian law, on EU law, or on American law, but an independent system for foreign direct investors, businesses basically, or investors in businesses, to be able to sue countries in order to make sure that they get the most profit and that they're not being wronged. So that's another big issue. Another really good example of this is several years ago, Ontario, I think it is, developed this program where they were trying to encourage business investment in solar power. And it was called the Ontario Green Energy Tariff, which basically required wind and solar projects that were developed in Ontario between 2009 and 2011 to have at least 25% of the materials that were in these products made in Ontario. And after 2012, they wanted that to increase to 50%. Basically, trying to make sure that they had a robust solar industry in Ontario, in Canada. Now, when they did this, both Japan and the EU lodged a complaint saying that basically Canada was violating its responsibilities under what's called the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is basically like the massive organization that exists as kind of a space for all free trade to occur. And Japan and the EU won. They officially got Canada to not be able to implement the Ontario Green Energy Tariff. And so when you go to Ontario now, yeah, there's some solar projects, but not nearly on the scale that they would have hoped. This was right in the time after the big financial crisis. 2009. A lot of businesses had been decimated. Lots of jobs had been lost. The government was trying to find a way to help spur investment, to help economies recover, and to encourage renewable energy use. I mean, it seems like a win-win. But because of their commitments under a scheme that's roughly equivalent to the free trade agreements we've been talking about, they weren't allowed to do that. And they had to kind of cede power to this larger agreement that they had entered into.
Well, that answers a lot of the questions that I have, and I'm sure that is a lot of information for the general public
Certainly.
to digest, and a lot of things to think about in relation to this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it's kind of heavy, but
it's one that hopefully we'll address in the future.
Certainly,
too, as I learn more about this. You certainly know a lot, and I will learn more about this as the weeks go on, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to bring up, this is unrelated to our previous conversation, But one of the things that listeners might want to look for in the week ahead, things that are going on in the world. Many people might have heard of, well, the refugee crisis that's going on in Europe right now. And in particular, a place called the Jungle in a French town of Calais. Calais. Sorry. I can't help myself sometimes.
Well, you are fluent in French.
Yes.
So.
Anyway, this big kind of tent city almost, full of migrants who were hoping to make it to the UK, to England, have been camped out in Calais, which is where the Channel kind of comes up from underneath the English Channel. And on Monday, the French government has said that they are going to go in and start closing that kind of encampment. And many people are concerned that human rights violations will occur in the process, or they don't know where these people will go. And I think that the EU crisis is an interesting thing we might be able to talk for a little bit about, and probably will be the subject of a future podcast. But that's definitely one thing to keep an eye on.
So the next section that we're going to talk about is the documentary of the week that we recommend our listeners to watch. And this week's documentary is called Do the Math. It's made by an organization called 350.org. I think we briefly mentioned them last week. Mm-hmm. The narrator is Bill McKibben, who is the head of 350.org and a very effective and well-known environmental speaker. And in this documentary, he essentially goes through the math of climate change. And so he has 3 numbers that shed some light on the situation that we're in. And these 3 numbers are 2 degrees Celsius, which is the number of, it's the amount of warming that the most conservative estimates say is safe. So we cannot go over 2 degrees Celsius of warming and still be able to function the way that our society does and continue to exist in the way that we do.
And that's the number that countries agreed to last year at the Paris Climate Agreement, right?
Yeah. Or I think it was in 2009. I can't remember. I think it might have been another, the Copenhagen Accord. That's what it was.
Yeah.
The second number is 565 gigatons, which is the estimate of the amount of carbon that can be released into the atmosphere for the warming of the Earth to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. So that is the limit that we can burn in order to stay under 2 degrees. And the third number is the one that sort of puts these numbers in the first 2 into perspective, and that is 2,795 gigatons, which is the amount of carbon that the world's leading oil companies have in reserve. That is 5 times the amount of carbon that we are able to burn to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. And this is a scary number, because this is, these energy companies, actually, no, I shouldn't call them energy companies. I should call them petroleum companies. These petroleum companies have this incredible amount in reserve, and they're already basing their future projections and investments off of these numbers. So they are absolutely expecting to burn this amount of carbon, if not more. And what this means for us is that we will skyrocket over the limit of carbon that we can release into the atmosphere to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. So at this point, if we did nothing, we're doomed.
Yeah.
As far as climate change goes, we will see in warming temperatures far beyond the reasonable limit that we can survive at.
I think one of the other things, by the way, Do the Math is on YouTube, so anybody can go look it up. It's a rather short documentary, I think 25 minutes or so. But to get back to what you were saying, John, one of the other numbers that stands out to me is the number of gigatons that the world burns every year. So the second number that John talked about was 595 gigatons. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of our carbon budget.
565.
565. Each year, the world burns approximately 30 gigatons of carbon, which means that we have about 23, 25 maybe years of business as usual until we hit the point where we're locked into 2 degrees Celsius. That number takes into account the idea of technologies evolving to try and reduce the amount of emissions, but that's a rather conservative estimate. Certain people say that it'll only take us 16 years to blow past our carbon budget. So these numbers and what I think John is alluding to is that prove that this is an issue we have to be taking very seriously right now. They're not something that can wait another 20 years like we had to wait for the Paris Agreement to be signed, for everybody to agree that this is an issue that we need to address.
Yeah, and this connects back with our debates this year. I mean, we're one of the leading countries in the world as far as emissions goes, and we didn't even bring up climate change in the presidential debates, and I think that it's really unfortunate, and it's frightening to think about the effect that we could have on our environment, on our planet, if we continue the way that we are.
Mm-hmm. So, if you guys are interested in learning more about the math of climate change, check out Do the Math on YouTube. Search, if you want a more in-depth analysis, maybe check out Bill McKibben's op-ed in Rolling Stone called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. This was actually written several years ago. Yeah. So we're deeper into this than even this might say.
Yeah, this article was written in 2012, and I think the documentary was produced in 2013,
2014.
Yeah. So change needs to occur if we're going to combat this.
And coming back to the final thought that we'll leave you with this week, one of the things that actually got mentioned last week too, is the idea of divestment. That people power can be used to make companies and organizations be accountable, make them accountable for these numbers and for being honest with themselves about the damage that they're doing by investing in fuel companies that expect the world to go past 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So with that, we're wrapping up our second edition of Adsum. We hope that you'll join us next time. And until we do, this is Aaron Danowski.
And I'm Jon Snow.
And we thank you for listening.